In 2018, the vast majority of astronomers and astrophysicists, virtually the entire scientific community, believed that this is what Oumuamua looked like. A long, cigar-shaped asteroid. Well, not an asteroid, actually. It was a comet, outgassing as it left our solar system, increasing its speed mysteriously, but not mysteriously, because we'd seen comets do this a number of times before. Hadn't we? Well, actually, no, we hadn't. And consequently, these very same astronomers and astrophysicists have had to change their theories about Oumuamua time and again. And one thing that they will not do, even if their fingernails are being torn off, is admit the possibility, in fact the probability, that this was not an asteroid or a comet or anything else natural, anything that we've observed in the past, anything that our universe could have created on its own. Rather, something that was created by an intelligence not very much unlike us. But here's a few details that just about everybody can agree on. In 2017, something coming in on a parabolic trajectory from outside our solar system passed through our inner solar system to make a close encounter with our sun. It actually passed almost directly through the Goldilocks zone of our inner solar system and then made its way out at a tremendous rate of speed. And it's at that point that theories begin to differ, because Oumuamua began exhibiting behavior unlike anything that we have ever observed. And it is this behavior that has led the scientific community to come up with the most wild and implausible theories about Oumuamua's origins and composition. First, they said that it was an iceberg made out of pure hydrogen. Now, just recently, they've suggested that it was an iceberg made out of pure nitrogen. Not a comet, as you're seeing right here, as scientists firmly and stubbornly believed for quite some time, but were forced to abandon it when it was very apparent that Oumuamua was not a comet. Instead, they've had to resort to the most dramatic and improbable theories to come up with some sort of natural explanation, whereas in fact there is a perfectly plausible explanation that they refuse to look at as firmly and steadfastly as the Catholic Church refused to look through Galileo's telescope centuries ago. Instead, they now claim that Oumuamua was not a comet or an asteroid, nor was it shaped like a cigar, but instead it looked something like this. An improbably thin, pancake-shaped object that somehow survived a close encounter with our sun, even though it's made out of frozen hydrogen or frozen nitrogen, which have very low boiling points, and now is making its way out of the solar system to go befuddle somebody else. Well, I'm about to explain to you why this explanation falls completely flat, and why another explanation, put forward by a very respected astrophysicist, the chair, actually, of Harvard's astrophysics department until last year, makes so much more sense and is backed up by all the evidence. Why am I so certain? Well, we're going to find out in just a few minutes. Good morning, and welcome to yet another episode of the Angry Astronaut. Still stranded here in Louisiana, just across the border from the Stennis test stands until Monday. And I have decided, in the midst of reading a fascinating book, that I would put out another video as quickly as possible. And I am sans glasses now by choice, because although I always want to be taken seriously when I'm talking about scientific matters, matters of engineering, space flight, etc., you throw on the sunglasses and you may lose a little bit of credibility with some people. And I'm about to talk about a subject that has a lot of controversy associated with it. And that, of course, is extraterrestrial civilizations. And this is associated with proof that has been gathered, or what rather was gathered some time ago, about an object that all of us, I think, are very familiar with now, and that is Oumuamua. And the book that I read, which I think probably a number of you have also read, came from Dr. Avi Loeb. However, I want to make it very clear that Dr. Loeb is not the only person, not the only respected scientist in this field who believes that it is very possible that Oumuamua was of extraterrestrial origin, of intelligent origin. There are a number of others who have actually co-authored studies with him, who have refuted natural explanations for these things. And his theory continues to hold up. It continues to be the most likely scenario for Oumuamua. And the vast majority of people in the scientific community would completely dismiss what I'm saying right now for reasons that I can't begin to understand. Because with all of the planets out there that exist, to our knowledge, within what we call the Goldilocks zone of any given star, with the tremendous number of exoplanets that we've discovered, it is arrogance beyond belief for us to think that we are alone in the universe, even that we're alone in the galaxy, or even amongst our local grouping of stars, especially over the entire history of this region of space. It's absurd. And yet that is what the scientific community would have us believe, that everything can be explained with natural phenomena, even Oumuamua. But as you are about to see, and as I indicated in the introduction, Oumuamua was an object that defied all explanation, and to this day continues to defy explanation for a wide variety of reasons that is backed up by a tremendous amount of observational data. This isn't anecdotal evidence. This isn't somebody telling a story. This isn't somebody who saw a UFO one day or anything like that. This isn't the nonsense that you see on shows like Ancient Aliens. This is observational data, and this is a highly respected scientist at Harvard University who has spent his entire life studying phenomena in astronomy. That is all that this man has done for the most part throughout his life. To say that he's an expert in the field is an understatement, and he's not the only one, as I said, who believes all of this. But I'm not going to keep chattering on. I want to get straight to the evidence. Oumuamua, most probably, in my opinion, definitely was our first encounter with an extraterrestrial civilization. Why am I so certain? We're about to find out right now. This is the first, and to my knowledge, the only artist depiction of what Oumuamua probably looks like, and all of the data and scientific evidence supports this notion and everything that goes with it, whereas the object on the right is what the scientific community would have us believe that Oumuamua looked like, well, until they embrace the whole pancake theory. And during the course of this episode, I am going to be quoting extensively from a book called Extraterrestrial, The First Sign of Intelligent Life Beyond Earth, written by this man, Dr. Avi Loeb, over at Harvard University. And as I said before, he was the chair of astronomy over at this university for 10 years, and only stepped down in 2020 because he was tired of all of the media attention, or so the theory goes. But But I want to make one thing perfectly clear. Although he believes that the evidence strongly supports the notion that Oumuamua was of intelligent origin, it is not 100% conclusive. However, there are no natural explanations that come close to conclusive evidence. The artificial explanation is the only one that explains all of the phenomena surrounding this mysterious object. Now, forgive me for retelling the story a bit, but it's good for us to do this in order to get a perspective on exactly what Oumuamua did as it passed through our solar system. It began to revolve around the sun on September 6th of 2017, reaching perihelion, which is the point at which its trajectory took it closest to the sun, on September 9th. And at this point it was moving at 58,900 miles per hour. It passed through Venus's orbital distance from the sun around September 29th and through Earth's orbital distance around October 7th. It was only at this point that the Panoramic Telescope and Rapid Response System, or PAN-STARRS, in Hawaii took notice of Oumuamua after it was well past Earth on October 19th. Now already, I think a few details need to be mentioned. First of all, Oumuamua was not detected until it was 20 million miles away from our planet. Secondly, Oumuamua passed within 0.25 astronomical units of the Sun, very close and being subjected to a large amount of solar heat. On top of that, it passed within 0.16 astronomical units of Earth when it made its pass through our orbit. Now that is a substantial distance, but ridiculously close when you consider interstellar distances by a comparison. By mid-November 2017, the International Astronomical Union knew that they had something very unusual and unique that was under observation. First, they thought it was a comet, then an asteroid, and finally they identified it as an interstellar object on its way rapidly out of our solar system. But already, Oumuamua was throwing astronomers for a loop. First of all, its brightness varied tremendously by a factor of 10, and it indicated that the object was rotating once every 8 hours, and that it was at least 5 to 10 times longer than it was wide. Not only that, the object was unusually bright given its size. And this was just the beginning. On top of all of these details, the Spitzer Space Telescope, which was specifically designed to detect infrared heat emissions from objects in space, was unable to detect any heat coming from Oumuamua whatsoever, which made absolutely no sense given how close it had passed to the sun during its passage through our solar system. Oumuamua was becoming more mysterious by the moment. And by the way, the Spitzer telescope detected a huge ring, previously undetected, orbiting Saturn at a tremendous distance when our other telescopes had fallen flat with similar observations, and yet it could detect no heat whatsoever from Oumuamua. In order to avoid detection from Spitzer's infrared equipment, this object would have to be razor thin, far thinner than what you're looking at right now. To paraphrase Dr. Loeb, it would be the equivalent of sitting at a dinner party and suddenly noticing a guest whose waist is the same thickness as her wrist. And getting back to Oumuamua's luminosity, it proved to be very bright, at least 10 times more reflective than typical solar system asteroids or comets. And if Oumuamua was about a few hundred meters across, as scientists assumed that it was, then its reflectivity would approach unprecedented values, as Dr. Loeb says, levels of brightness similar to a shiny metal. That doesn't sound like anything natural. That sounds like what we're looking at right now. And so, to quickly review, Oumuamua was an impossibly thin, impossibly reflective object, at least when compared to natural objects that we've seen in the past, that went through our solar system tumbling at a rate of once every 8 hours without fail. All of these things would be looked upon as extraordinary. What Oumuamua did next was even more shocking. According to the European Southern Observatory, quote, "Unlike all asteroids and comets observed before, this object was not bound by the sun's gravity. Oumuamua originated from interstellar space and returned there with a velocity boost as a result of its passage near the sun." Huh? Let's try this again. According to Dr. Loeb, quote, "In 2018, researchers reported that Oumuamua's trajectory deviated slightly, but to a highly statistically significant extent, from a path shaped by the sun's gravity alone. This is because it accelerated away from the sun, being pushed by an additional force that declined roughly as the square from the distance from the sun, a repulsive force that was not identified." And how significant was this deviation? Well, absolutely tiny by interstellar standards, but utterly colossal by terrestrial standards. No less than 100,000 kilometers. That's right, Oumuamua, during the time that we observed it, moved an additional 100,000 kilometers beyond the point that it should have traveled while it was under the influence of the sun's gravity. This led scientists to believe that it had to be a comet, because only cometary outgassing could possibly explain this. However, if Oumuamua was a comet, it would have had to have lost 1/10 of its mass to account for this much of a deviation, which would have left a lot of vapor and dust particles, which would not have been missed by any of our telescopes. And yet, intense investigations of this object did not reveal any trace of water, carbon-based gases, or dust, ruling out the possibility that it was being pushed by cometary vapor or visible dust particles. This again, according to Dr. Loeb. But don't take his word for it. Take the observational data's word for it. The infrared camera on the Spitzer Space Telescope, which was trained on Oumuamua for 30 hours and should have been able to detect even trace carbon dioxide in Oumuamua's outgassing. But it did not. It detected nothing. As a matter of fact, it didn't even detect any heat coming off of the object, indicating that it must be shinier than a typical comet or asteroid, as I said before. And then finally, while summing up their findings, the scientists who studied the Spitzer data acknowledged they, quote, "did not detect the object." But then they went on to say that, quote, "Oumuamua's trajectory shows non-gravitational accelerations that are sensitive to size and mass and presumably caused by gas emissions," unquote. Observation: you see no gas emissions. Conclusion: there must be gas emissions. And in case you think that the Spitzer was just having a bad day, the Solar and Heliospheric Observatory, or SOHO, also was keeping the sun under close observation in 2017 when Oumuamua was near perihelion, which of course is closest to the sun. It was built to observe any comets passing close by as it's observing this particular comet. And during this time, this telescope also detected nothing. To paraphrase Dr. Loeb, invisible to Spitzer's IRAC, to SOHO, and to just about any other instrument, and yet Oumuamua deviated. And so this is why scientists and astronomers the world over have come up with all of these outlandish theories, imagining icebergs made out of frozen hydrogen or frozen nitrogen, anything that would not have been detected by all of these instruments, even though we have detected nothing like this in the entire history of our exploration and observation of the solar system. But here's another problem. I don't give a damn what an object is made out of. If it's natural, it's not going to have a regular shape. and an irregular shape would create irregular outgassing and not a steady acceleration as was observed with the Oumuamua. On top of that, any outgassing from any object we have seen in the past changes its rate of tumbling, and yet Oumuamua continued to tumble at precisely the same rate. And finally, after listing all of these characteristics which defy natural explanation, Dr. Loeb points out the most obvious and understandable explanation, an object that we have already conceived of and created, an object moved not by cometary outgassing, but by solar radiation, a light sail. Working together with a postdoctoral fellow named Dr. Bialy at Harvard's Institute for Theory and Computation, the two determined how thick Oumuamua would have to be in order to be moved to this degree of deviation by solar radiation alone, and they came up with an object only a few millimeters thick. In other words, an object that's already been created by the Planetary Society, perhaps not on as grandiose a scale, but nevertheless the same kind of technology. And unlike an iceberg made out of hydrogen or nitrogen, this would not fall apart or be incinerated by a close encounter with the sun. It would actually be designed to take maximum advantage of it. Plus, it would accelerate slowly and smoothly when exposed to the sun's light, just as it was observed with the Oumuamua. Such an object would be so thin that the Spitzer Space Telescope would not register any solar radiation coming off of it. Such an object would be highly reflective. Such an object would keep the same rate of tumbling when solar radiation was striking it, if it had technological modifications to account for such things. In other words, simple reaction control thrusters to keep its rate of tumbling at the same rate. So many things that an artificial construct would be able to account for that natural objects do not. Still not satisfied? Well, a light sail would also maintain a constant and steady rate of acceleration that was inversely proportional to its distance from the sun, exactly as Oumuamua did. And one thing I forgot to mention, Oumuamua was traveling at a speed that is called the local standard of rest compared to the rest of objects in the galaxy before our sun encountered it. That is an unbelievably unlikely occurrence, a 0.2% chance to be precise. So this object was designed essentially to let the galaxy go rotating past it, which would be an ideal thing for, say, a marker buoy or something that was simply observing the galaxy over a long period of time. Oumuamua could also be a broken down light sail, a piece of space trash if you will, but it really doesn't matter what it might be, because the scientific community as a whole continues to insist that it was something that looks like this, even though something like this would not survive a close encounter with the sun, especially if it was made out of frozen nitrogen or frozen hydrogen. It's just impossible, and yet this is what they continue to cling to, just as the Catholic Church refused to gaze through Galileo's telescope. But after being confronted by an army of reporters a couple of years ago, Dr. Loeb said something similar, and of course he was confronted with the question, does that mean you think you're Galileo? Well, of course he said no. But you know what? I say yes. Because in a world where it's so much easier to get a job as a tenured astronomer or physicist contemplating the universe of multiple realities and multiple dimensions, even though such things have yet to be confirmed with observational data, this man has decided to wander into the world of extraterrestrial civilizations at risk of lumping himself together with the crazies who talk about Skinwalker Ranch and the dimensional portals that supposedly open there and things along those lines. That's a great deal of courage, and this one scientist and his associates are taking us into a new universe, and we need to track Oumuamua down. especially after we develop nuclear thermal propulsion and confirm this man's hypothesis for the betterment of the human race. That is, if it hasn't moved again. You know, I'd like to take every minute of every episode of Ancient Aliens and shows like it, put it all onto one server, and subject the whole damn thing to a giant electromagnetic pulse and just wipe the whole damn thing off the face of the planet. That's how angry this whole situation makes me. These ridiculous shows that have no scientific foundation, with all of these experts with questionable degrees and funny looking beards. But the difference is that Oumuamua was under observation from multiple instruments, as I said in the video, for an extended period of time. And every natural explanation simply falls flat. Outgassing from any sort of element that it might be comprised of. A piece of nitrogen, which, by the way, we've never seen in our own solar system, even though we have plenty of objects that have a lot of frozen nitrogen in it that could have been flung out by some sort of meteoroid impact in the past. We've never seen anything like that, but you know, that must be what it is, huh? Well, no, it can't be. For the reasons that I stated in the video. It can't be a hydrogen iceberg. It can't be any of these things that the scientific community desperately grasps at to try to find some sort of implausible explanation as to why there was no visual evidence of any sort of contrail, of any residue left over from outgassing, as every type of comet that we have ever observed leaves behind it. No, Oumuamua's acceleration was not produced by outgassing. There's only one natural explanation, and that is solar radiation. And for solar radiation to have created the phenomena that it did, the acceleration, or rather lack of deceleration because of the sun's gravitational influence, for this to have happened, Oumuamua would have to be a few millimeters thick. That can't happen in the natural world. And it gets me so angry when the scientific establishment refuses to even consider it and just dismisses it, or at best says that, well, maybe it could be, but it's most probably natural, although we can't produce any natural explanations that hold up. It's annoying. And it goes beyond just extraterrestrial technology that we detect. When the scientific community puts its blinders on these sorts of things, then people start to distrust everything that the scientific community says. Global warming, COVID, everything else that the scientific community tells us about these things, that it's very important for us to pay attention to, and people start to distrust them when the scientific community remains so narrow-minded and inflexible when it comes to their viewpoints. And I find it to be very frustrating, and also it starts to become very dangerous when the public begins to distrust the scientific community for very good reasons. Okay, I'm done ranting. If you like the way I rant, if you like what I talk about, it's all in the description, but I'm going to leave you now, and hopefully my next episode will come from South Carolina when I return home. But until the scientific establishment admits and acknowledges not only the possibility, but the reality of other civilizations besides ourselves, and the technology that they produce that we have observed with our own instruments, until they acknowledge these facts, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.